Welcome to Worldview Matters, discussing controversial issues, discerning current events, defending biblical Christianity. No topic off limits. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazzo.
Hey friends, God bless you, brothers and sisters in Christ. Thank you so much for tuning in and sharing the podcast. It has become socially acceptable to express open hostility against men today. The Washington Post asks, why can't we hate men? Almost half of American men agree that these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. Best-selling author of Love Thy Body, Professor Nancy Pearcey is here today to explain how secularism has villainized the concept of masculinity, and it seems the primary target is Christian men in America. Her latest book, which we'll be talking about today, is called The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. This reveals surprising answers to at least three big questions. Where did the idea come from that masculinity is toxic? The second question, what impact did secularism have on the script for masculinity? And the third, and there's many more, but these are three big ones. How do Christian men shatter these negative stereotypes? Professor Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. I wanted her on this podcast for a long time. She's been quoted in The New Yorker, Newsweek. She's been on Huckabee and other outlets. She's highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Welcome to Worldview Matters, Nancy. Good to have you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that was a mouthful. I could barely get that out. But very important book, and you've written about this before and these topics, and you comment on these. You do a lot of interviews on these. So let's start with you just responding to basically why this book as a follow-up to Love Thy Body.
Yeah, well, my attention was caught by the kind of quotes that you started with. You know, the one that you mentioned, the Washington Post saying, why can't we hate men? Yeah. That was the one that really caught my eye. And I said, I've got to write about this. But it's everywhere. The Huffington Post editor said, she tweeted #KillAllMen, and then said it was a joke. And speaking of jokes, you can buy T-shirts that say things like, so many men, so little ammunition. And books with very blunt titles like, I hate men, and No Good Men, and Are Men Necessary? And then what really wrung my heart, actually, was that men are jumping on the same bandwagon. A male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then this one you may have seen because it was in the news just a few months ago. The director of the movie Avatar said, testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So this is the first thing I wanted to do in the book was, where is this coming from? Why does the secular world get its view of masculinity so wrong? You know, how can we critique it as Christians, and how can we offer a biblical alternative?
So how far back in your estimation, in your studies, do you think there were probably catalysts for this kind of thinking, this ideology, which is so much, the LGBTQ, so many things come, the feminist, radical feminism and other things. Does it go back to the 50s? It seems like in the 40s and 50s, America was somewhat balanced and well-adjusted and family-oriented, but maybe I'm wrong. Just share some insight on that for us.
Yeah, so this was really surprising because most people think it probably started with second wave feminism, 1960s. But when I started looking at the research, it turns out that you can find this negative language applied to men already in the 19th century. It starts after the Industrial Revolution, because before that, men worked alongside their family members all day, their wives and their children, on the family farm, the family business, the family industry. And so the cultural expectation on men focused much more on their caretaking role. In fact, surprisingly, the vast majority of the literature on child rearing and parenting was addressed to fathers. Today, if you go into a typical bookstore, they're addressed to mothers.
Yeah.
But fathers were seen as the primary parent because they were home all day. And so they were interacting with their children just as much as mothers were. And so the question is, how did we lose that? The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And so, of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, instead of working with their family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And as you can imagine, that was a very different environment. And that's when you see the literature start to change. Already back then, people started to say men are losing that caretaking ethos. They're beginning to be egocentric, self-seeking, greedy, acquisitive, turning their jobs, their career success into an idol. That was a common phrase back then, by the way, that the society is secularizing and men are turning their work success into an idol. And so actually, that's what was surprising, is it started back in the 19th century. And of course, that does also indicate what we need to do to fix it. If it was started because men were separated from their families all day, the solution has to be, can we find ways to reconnect fathers with their families? Even in an industrial age, are there ways we can tweak the workplace and get fathers to have more time with their families?
Wow. There's so much that goes into this, too. The modern attacks on the family make this even worse. I want to give the websites, friends. I didn't give that up front, but Nancy's website, of course, nancypearcey.com. And the book, 5-star reviews. It's doing incredibly well over on Amazon, The Toxic War on Masculinity. So you say, Nancy, the Bible calls men to be both tough and tender, both courageous and caring. Men who know they are made in God's image can be full persons, reflecting all the rich dimensions of God's own character. So let's start with the good news. People often accuse evangelical Christian men of being oppressive. They're all against the patriarchy, right? Prone to abuse. But you make the surprising claim that they test out as having the lowest levels of abuse and divorce. Please explain this, because people are hearing the opposite all the time.
Absolutely. I sort of stumbled on this research, and I was as surprised as anyone. I was doing my research on the secular view, and then I ran into the sociological research on Christians and said, oh, wow, I've got the answer. But what happened is, you're right, the secular narrative is that Christians are, if anything, exhibit A of toxic masculinity. I'll give you just one example. It was easy to find. But the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement, said the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today.
Wow.
And what happened is social scientists were listening and saying, but where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And I cite about a dozen different studies in my book where they find that evangelical Christian men who are committed, who attend church regularly, who are authentic in their faith, actually do test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. Their wives test out as the happiest. And by the way, they do interview the wives separately. I'm constantly asked that, so I have to mention that. They're interviewed separately. Christian fathers spend more time with their children, 3.5 hours more per week than secular men. Christian couples divorce, as you noted, at a lower rate, 35% lower than secular couples. And then the real surprise is that they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So sometimes a quote can kind of crystallize it. So let me give you a quote. The sociologist who did the largest study is from the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he gets published in the New York Times. So this is a New York Times article in which he said, direct quote, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. So this is not a pep talk from some religious leader. This is solid empirical research. This is evidence-based findings, and we should be very confident about bringing it into the public square to defeat the secular narrative, but also into the churches, because it's not there yet. I had to go digging in academic journals to find this. Wow. So it's not in the churches either. We need to bring this out where we can use it to encourage and support Christian men who are in fact doing very well.
I'm glad I'm sitting down, because you said that even the New York Times reported this. So I love what you said, where's your evidence, right? Because they put out the talking points and they don't feel like they have to defend them, because it's a barrage of accusations and criticisms against, Christian men in America, and it has become toxic. But in the book, Nancy, 32 images and a study guide for either personal or a small group study, your book says men are being torn between two competing scripts for masculinity. What are these two scripts?
Yeah, I put this right at the front of the book, and I have to tell you a little bit of the background. It's the most controversial book I've ever written, which surprised me.
Yeah.
Because my earlier book on Love Thy Body was on abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, and I had no idea that masculinity was a bigger trigger word.
Wow.
But I always do a lot of reading groups on my books to rub off the rough edges. And when they would tell their friends and family they were going through a manuscript on masculinity, invariably the first question was, well, whose side is she on? And men tended to assume that a woman writing a book on masculinity would be a male-bashing feminist, and more progressive types tended to assume that you were a red pill, culture warrior. So I put this at the front of the book to be able to say, look, you're not either pro or con masculinity. There are different versions out there. And this came out of a study by a sociologist. And the sociologist is very well known and speaks all around the world. And so he came up with a very ingenious experiment to find out what young men themselves are feeling these days. And he asked them two questions. First, he says, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the sociologist said all around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately start listing things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And the sociologist would say, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe. Or we would say, the men are made in God's image. And they do have this universal innate sense that their unique masculine strengths are not given them, to get whatever they want, but to provide and protect those that they care for. It seems to be part of general revelation, or Romans 2, we all have a conscience. But then he would follow up. The sociologist would ask a second question. He'd say, what if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, never show weakness, suck it up, win at all costs, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And so he concluded that men do feel trapped between these two competing scripts, that there is this innate and universal sense of the good man. And I find that very encouraging, that that men do have a sense of being made in God's image. And these were not just countries with a Christian background. This was around the whole globe. But they also feel cultural pressure to live up to the quote unquote, the real man. And those traits are quite different. Not that they're all bad. We want people who can hang tough in a crisis. But if it gets separated from a moral ideal, then which it is in the secular world today, then it can slide into misogyny, dominance, control, and so on. But it also gives us a better way to deal with these issues. Most men don't respond very well to being called toxic. Like nobody would. So instead, can we tap into that innate, universal, inherent knowledge of what it means to be the good man? And that gives us a much more positive way to approach these issues.
Oh, friends, so much more to come. We're speaking with Nancy Pearcey. The book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, you get on Amazon or her website, nancypearcey.com. We'll be right back on Worldview Matters.
Today's show is brought to you by Harbinger's Daily, world news biblically understood. Stay informed at harbingersdaily.com.
Friends, I want to thank some recent donors to Worldview Matters. Polly from Green Bay, Michael from Mexico City, Shelley from LeClaire, Iowa. Thank you guys so very much. God bless you for keeping us going. We are doing our fundraiser here in the spring. And by the way, we have an opportunity to expand our reach with the help of Pioneer Network, Beck TV, and God's Learning Channel. If you've not already donated to Worldview Matters, by the way, it's tax deductible. We're asking if you could consider supporting us, production costs for the next 6 months, and allow us to purchase time on these three networks. So if you are able to financially give a gift of $200, great. If you can do $25 a month, great. We'd love, as our way of saying thank you, to send you a signed copy of Alex Newman's newest book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Or, your choice, you can get my latest book, Assault on the Image of God. First-time donors will also get this mug you see on every Worldview Matters show. It's got Worldview Matters on one side, the other side, my tagline, keep speaking the truth about things that matter. So the website, worldviewmatters.tv. Back with Nancy Pearcey. So I wanted to ask you about this before. There's so many questions I have, but I want to skip ahead because I think of what Hollywood has done. And you probably know better than I do. I'm thinking of how they portrayed men in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Particularly, everybody loves Raymond. Raymond was just an idiot. Men were really portrayed as almost useless, dumb, bumbling, unnecessary, maybe. They made a mockery of. So your thoughts on that? This strategy must have started even in the media and Hollywood. Go ahead and share what you know about that.
Yeah, so the Homer Simpson pattern, right, where fathers are portrayed as the bumbling idiot. One of my sons loved the Berenstain Bears, and the father was always the stupid one. And, we all know that, but most of us don't know where it came from.
Yeah.
And it turns out, once again, it started at the Industrial Revolution, because when fathers were taken out of the home, they were no longer with their children all day. And so they got sort of disconnected from the family dynamics. They didn't know their children as well. They didn't know what their children were feeling and thinking and experiencing throughout the day. And already in the 19th century, I was just shocked when I saw this. You start to see fathers portrayed as irrelevant, superfluous, and incompetent. I thought, really? All the way back then. But what we don't realize, you see, is we're so used to fathers being out of the home that we don't realize how traumatic that was at the time. Yeah. People felt like the family had just been gutted. 1842, Parents Magazine said, the greatest source of domestic sorrow today is paternal neglect. And another one said, the mainstay, the central person of the home, is hardly able to live with his family anymore. And the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who many historians say was the most influential woman of the 19th century, said the issue facing the family today is father absence. And here's how she put it. God is our father, and yet the prototype of the divine is gone from his family from Sunday to Sunday. And so when we look back at that, we realize this was really a huge change. And historians say things like, it is especially hard for boys, right? Since we're talking about masculinity. Girls at least still had their mother in the home as a model, but boys no longer had a day in, day out model of what it meant to be a man. And so historians write things like this was the first, identity crisis for boys. That boys got out of touch with the adult world. They lost their connection to the world of adult males. And so it was much harder for boys than for girls. And of course, that's what we're seeing all the way up to today, whereas, boys are the ones who are falling behind in school. Boys are the ones falling behind at all levels of education, all the way through high school, college. Do you know the average college now is 60% female and 40% male students? And then when they're adults, men are falling behind. Men are more likely than women to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, mentally ill, suicide. Um, Unemployment has gone way down. It's not showing up in the unemployment statistics because they stopped looking for work. So researchers had to dig deeper, and they tell us that male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels, which was also shocking. And then life expectancy has gone down as well. Women's has stayed the same, so it's not a general trend. But a magazine called The New Scientist had an article on this data, and it concluded the greatest demographic factor today for early death is being male. So
Wow.
I'd say it's time for us to have compassion on boys and men and start looking at, aren't there maybe some programs we should have to help boys and men, that they are the ones who really need the help these days.
Well, what you just listed and rattled off, education, health, employment, why do you think are so many people ignoring these very real problems facing men today?
Well, the first book written on boys falling behind in school was called The War Against Boys, and it was by Christina Hoff Sommers, who herself is a feminist. But she reports, she calls herself the rational feminist. And she reports that every time she tried to push for some kind of special programs for boys, it would be shot down by feminist groups because they acted as if it's a zero-sum proposition, that if you help boys, you're not going to help girls anymore, which is not true. We can do both.
Right.
You realize that the reason the girls pulled ahead is because they did get a lot of support. 1972, Title IX, 1994, Gender Equity Act. Millions of dollars were poured into equity workshops and curriculum and training materials. And the idea was we're going to bring girls up to where boys are. Nobody anticipated that girls would shoot right past the boys, but that's what's happened. They've shot right past them. And so now we need to say, well, we gave girls that kind of support. Maybe it's time to give boys that kind of support. And fortunately, I will tell you, there's a new book out by a liberal writer. See, this issue has gotten coded conservative. Like, it's conservatives who care about boys and men. Yeah. And that was another reason. Liberals were like, no, we're not going to talk about this. But fortunately, there's a liberal, his name is Richard Reeves, he's at the Brookings Institution, and he took the plunge. He was told, do not touch this issue, and he still did. He wrote a book called Of Boys and Men, and so now he's making it okay for liberal people to say, hey, maybe it is time to say that we need special programs for boys and men. So that's a good sign, at least.
Yes.
It's getting out of this sort of conservative, ghetto, and it's becoming more acceptable to say boys and men need help, and let's talk about some programs.
Well, so I hope we have time to squeeze in two more questions with Nancy Pearcey. Your book says the Darwinian theory of evolution normalized many traits in men that today are labeled toxic. How so?
Oh, yeah, I love that question because through my book, I go through several stages of how the script for masculinity turned secular. And that's one of the most important. And yet it's one that we never hear about because most people think Darwinism is about science. But the social Darwinists immediately began to say, oh, the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would be the ones who were ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and predatory. And so instead of urging men to live up to the image of God in them, they began to urge men to live down to what they called the beast within, their presumed animal nature. And that's not just historical. Evolutionary psychology is the new label for what used to be called social Darwinism. And there's still books being written with that same message. A best-selling book called The Moral Animal said the human male is an oppressive, possessive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving men advice on how to have a good marriage is like giving Vikings a booklet on how not to pillage.
Oh my
I thought, how does he get
goodness.
away with this negative view? But he can say, well, see, this is the message of evolution. And there's another one as well called Men in Marriage. It says the same thing. The male nature is violent, addiction prone, and predatory. The male deepest yearning is not for wife and family, but for the male group escape, the open road, the motorbike, to a primal and primitive and immediate gratification.
Jeez.
At any rate, to which we would say, really, you
Yeah.
think this is how God created men? To which you would also say, do you see the intellectual sources of the Andrew Tate phenomenon? It's not coming out of nowhere. It starts with the intellectuals talking like this, and then it produces the Andrew Tates who are out there, promoting a vision of masculinity, of fast cars, fast money, fast women, and which even Christian men are reaching out to. A former graduate student of mine now teaches high school, and she emailed me and said, all of my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school. So if the church is not giving out a biblical, healthy view of masculinity, our young men are going to be reaching out to these online influencers.
Wow. We just have a minute and a half left, Nancy. And by the way, follow her on Twitter. She comments on so many important issues, friends. Nancy Pearcey on Twitter X. What practical steps, if you can just name a couple, can fathers take to be more involved with their sons and, of course, their daughters?
Yeah, I think sheer presence is a big part of it. And the pandemic was a game changer. Harvard University did a study. It's so recent, it's not in the book, but Harvard did a study where they said the conclusion was during the pandemic, fathers who worked from home said that they got closer to their children. 68% of fathers said they don't want to lose that.
Oh, my
They would
goodness.
prefer to have some sort of hybrid arrangement, some sort of flexible arrangement, because they discovered they actually like, even in an industrial age, can we sort of tweak the workplace by having more flexible hours? And we found out we could. And by the way, we've got to get the CEOs on board too. So I have quotes from CEOs saying things like, we were a little suspicious about remote work, but this is a direct quote. During the pandemic completely exploded our fears. We did not see any discernible drop in productivity. So they're recognizing, too, that if you give fathers time to be better fathers, they also make better workers.
Well, I thank you for this insight and this book, and especially connecting the dots to the Industrial Revolution. That makes sense, and it's fascinating. Nancy Pearcey, God bless you, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. And friends, we will continue next week with some more great shows, but we appreciate your support and sharing the podcast where we are limited. God bless you, and as always, keep speaking the truth about things that matter.